Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm happy to be here, and this is a new way for me to present a talk. So, bear with me if it's not as great as it could possibly be, but I've never done one over Zoom before, so it's new territory for me too. So let me just get the show going. So the talk is on genealogy and postcards, and just a little background information on me. I've been collecting postcards since I was in the third grade, and I just turned 58. So it's quite a long time that I've been collecting. I've been doing genealogy since I was in the eighth grade. It was first assigned to me as a class project in school by a teacher who wanted to teach us how to do research. And it kind of just took with me, and I've been doing it ever since. So it seemed at some point along the way like a kind of natural thing for me to progress to was combining the two, but it took a little bit of discovery to kick that off. And so we'll talk about all of these things as we go through the talk. So let's just start with, what is genealogy? So what is genealogy? It comes from the Greek word genia, meaning generation, and logos, which is knowledge, and that's the study of families and the tracing of their lineages and history. Genealogists use oral traditions, historical records, genetic analysis, and other records to obtain information about a family and to demonstrate kinship and pedigrees of its members. The results are often displayed in charts or written as narratives, as family trees, or in books about the genealogies of families. So there are millions of genealogists worldwide, and we're hoping that there are millions of postcard collectors worldwide. So now it's time to bring these two worlds together to try and make some new discoveries. Here's where I first made the connection. I grew up in Lehigh County, Pennsylvania, which is about an hour north of Philadelphia, and in a small town that we pronounce as Metropole, even though it's Tripoli. But this is the town I'm from. And this was the first antique postcard I ever found of the town that I grew up in. And it's of the artificial lake, which was basically a lake that was created in a swampy area that fed a mill race that operated grist mills further downstream from it. So so that they could keep running when water got low in the creeks that served them and stuff. But I bought this postcard at an antique show and showed it to my uncle, who had been born in the same town in 1918. And he goes to me, "Oh, I know those guys. That's Menno Bachmann, the big fat guy in the boat on the left, and that's Fayen Bachmann in the boat in the middle." But he couldn't remember who the other guy was. And I was like, "Oh my God, really?" And at the time I was probably about 14 or 15, and I was just to make that connection through somebody who was still living to these people who had probably been gone for 50 years or more at that point. It just kind of really made this personal connection for me. And so I started collecting cards of this small town that I was from, but this is what started it. So here to me is what is always so amazing about postcards. And whenever I talk to non-postcard people, I try to say to them, anything that is of interest to you, no matter what it is, or anything that you currently have a passion for and collect, can also be collected on postcards. And genealogy is no exception to that. I mean, I've known people who have collected porch swings on postcards, and mosquitoes, and marbles, and people who collected bottle openers and collected postcards with bottle openers. I had a friend who collected antique cookie cutters and then collected postcards with cookies and cookie cutters on them. So it's a great way of augmenting any other kind of thing that you're interested in or collect, and genealogy is no exception to that. You can collect genealogy on postcards in a very literal sense, in the topical sense of genealogy on postcards. These two cards, to me, are perfect examples of genealogy on postcards. They're both from the same family, and I found them many years ago, and they were kind of the breakthrough ones for me that led me to see that, oh, you really can collect genealogy on postcards. These were from a family from Philadelphia. There's a tombstone. There's a plaque from a reading room in the Witherspoon building in Philadelphia about this family, about their genealogy, and this data that's included on these postcards to me is just amazing. Here's another one. And, I know that the subject of, racial history in America can be a little fraught with problems, but from a genealogical standpoint, and if any of you watch Finding Your Roots or something, you'll know that as it relates to African American history, that's one of the things that is very difficult to trace. Here is a postcard of a man who was born into slavery, lived in Halifax County, Virginia. He worked for this family who owned this shoe company, and here he was in their exhibit at the Jamestown Exposition in 1907. But look at the wealth of information that's included on this card about this man and his background and his history. So no matter how tragic that history is, if you were from that family and this was your genealogy, I would think that this would be an amazing find to uncover something like this with that much information about your relative. And here's another one. Tombstone inscriptions are pretty much the bread and butter of genealogy and genealogists. We're known to go traipsing through old cemeteries at the drop of a hat. And here's a fantastic postcard of the inscriptions on the slabs of the burial plots on the Washington family farm in Wakefield, Westmoreland County, Virginia, George Washington's family, all transcribed onto postcards. Another way that you can collect genealogy on postcards is family reunions. And here are two real photo postcards. On the top is the Garsh reunion, and on the bottom is a family group shot sent from Sister Mamie of West Point, Nebraska, to her brother William Landis and his wife Florence in Reading, Pennsylvania. Now, with that bit of information, it really wouldn't be hard to go back and trace who these people are, find out who they were, tie them into a family tree. But cards like this are out there in boxes just waiting to be discovered, because a lot of people look over cards like this and don't really pay a lot of attention to them. But if they were of your family, you'd be ecstatic to find something like this. Here's another one. This is the Kresge Monument in Gilbert, Pennsylvania, that tells the story of Conrad Kresge, who was one of the pioneers of that family in Pennsylvania, and the story of his child who was killed by a Native American, and the family reunion group pooled money together to have this massive memorial created and installed in the cemetery in Gilbert, Pennsylvania. And then there's cards like this, the Lutz family quintet from Lititz, Pennsylvania, where everyone is identified. It tells you who the children are, what they're playing. It's just a great card. And this is another weird one. I collect, for those that don't know, anything San Francisco, especially relating to the Panama Pacific Exposition from 1915. And this was a card that recently cropped up on eBay from Lititz, Pennsylvania, but it's got this fantastic story on the bottom about a baby coach that was supposed to be over 100 years old, that was sold at Peter Burkholder's sale on February 6, 1912, and was supposed to be exhibited at the Panama Pacific Exposition. If it ever was, I don't know. I've searched for it. I found an article online about the auction, but that's the extent of the information I can find. So I don't know if it ever actually made it to the PPIE or not. So now, setting that aside, and that was the literal subject of genealogy on postcards. If you are interested in your family history, or you want to enhance your genealogy by using postcards, I feel that there's kind of a three-level approach that you can take to using postcards to enhance family history. It kind of goes from a very wide ethnic and cultural basis down to a regional and local basis, and then down to a very fine-pointed personal basis. I will show you examples of all of these and how you can use them to enhance your family history and genealogy with postcards. So being of Pennsylvania German descent, I use the Pennsylvania Germans here and my own family in this talk as a bit of a case study. And this is a map from drawn off of the 2000 census showing the percent of Pennsylvania Germans, people who physically identify as being of Pennsylvania German descent throughout the country. And as you can see, it's color coded. The largest group of them are in the Berks and Lehigh and Schuylkill County areas in Pennsylvania, and to a lesser degree in some of the others. But you'll see that there are people in Southern California, counties in Southern California, that have a specific percentage of people, in Florida, in Indiana, in Ohio, in Michigan, in Wisconsin. And so the reason I show this is, a lot of people, in using this as a case study, I show it as an example of the fact that these families migrated, and as they migrated, so did their family history, their postcard collections, their photo albums, their genealogy, all of that stuff moved with them in a great many cases. And so even if your family was from Pennsylvania, you can find stuff all over the country. But the other nice thing about it is that the Pennsylvania Germans and Germans in general constitute one of the largest ethnic groups in America. And, you'd be amazed how many people all across the country at least have some connection to a Pennsylvania German family. So if you don't really know about your family or want to go researching it, you will be surprised to find that most of you will have some connection somewhere to some Pennsylvania German family. So it started with me trying to find my own family. And like I said, that started in the 8th grade for me. And I've been working on it off and on over the years. I've traced a great many of my lines back many, many generations, back to Germany and Switzerland and places like that. I use Ancestry. I used Family Tree Maker as a program for tracing my family. And I've been incredibly fortunate in that I have kind of become a repository for people in my family who know that I'm interested in my family history. When they have old photos or they have old postcards or they have things like that, they pass them along to me when they're downsizing or when they don't have children that are interested or whatever. So I've gotten a lot of great stuff from people just by letting them know that I was interested in our family's history. And so most of these pictures that you see on here were pictures that people gave to me because they knew that I was interested in our family. And so let's start with that very broad category of collecting, the ethnic and cultural examples. This covers a range of topics from dress and lifestyle to language, occupational, home life, all kinds of things. So you can collect the old country, wherever your family was from. You can find cards from the country that you were from the towns that they were from. Postcards were so prevalent all over the world at that point in time that you can enhance anything. That card on the top is a Swiss flag, but it was an interesting card that was done for an exhibition at John Wanamaker's department store in Philadelphia, a Swiss exhibition. The other one is a German kind of Grußhaus style card, but there are all kinds of cards like this that you can use to enhance your collecting and your history. This is a great series of cards showing flags and coats of arms of the different states and territories of Germany. And wherever you're from, you can find it. And again, I'm using the Germans as an example, but almost any country, there are cards like this from every country in Europe, a great many other countries that don't maybe necessarily have this coats of arms type of thing, have other types of family things that you can trace. So there are all kinds of places that you can go looking for this kind of information if you just want to enhance your genealogy with it. This is an interesting card that shows the way our ancestors dressed. It's from Switzerland. And if you follow that kind of path, it goes back and forth showing the chieftain or the clothing of the people of the different regions. My family, a great many of them come from Bern Canton, which are those women on the top row there, kind of just to the right of center, that look like those dinosaurs in Jurassic Park that put the things out. They have those big hats on. But you can see, you know, the clothing styles of the different areas of the country of Switzerland. Here are German, a German, I think, singing group up on the top left, and on the bottom is a postcard showing the old order Amish in the Lancaster, Pennsylvania area, who still dress like that to a great degree. Then there are things like language that you can collect on postcards. The Pennsylvania Germans speak a variation of the German language, which has a lot more to do with Swiss German than it does actual German. You know, they often talk about High German, Low German, and this Swiss German dialect flips words around, where the German translation is kind of a very literal translation. So when Pennsylvania Germans speak Pennsylvania German, but it gets translated to English, their words kind of get flipped around, and they'll say things like, throw Papa down the stairs his hat, or the pie is all, but the cake is yet, or, you know, it's just this very colloquial style of speaking, but it's very prevalent in the area in which I grew up. My mother, who just recently passed away, was born in 1930, and she only spoke Pennsylvania German for the first 6 years of her life. They lived on a farm, and it wasn't until they moved into a small town and she had to start going to school where she had to speak English. They spoke solely Pennsylvania German, and Pennsylvania German is still spoken in Pennsylvania today. Then you can collect cards that show the way we lived. Here's a fantastic hand-tinted real photo postcard from Sagersville, Lehigh County, and it's an old spring house, one of the few of this type left in the area. And spring houses, for those that don't know, were built over an open spring, and people put their milk and their vegetables and their dairy products and things into this spring house, oftentimes setting it right into the spring in containers to keep their things fresh and cold in the days before electrical refrigeration were available, or in places where they didn't even necessarily have ice for ice boxes. This was the way you kept your food cold in the early days. On the top is an old lime kiln. In Pennsylvania, these were a very common sight not all that terribly long ago. They would take limestone and burn it in that opening to burn it down to just lime that they would then spread on their fields as fertilizer. On the bottom is an old hand pump that you regularly saw on old farms, and even in towns, houses had these old pumps behind them for people to get water. And then there are things like the horse and buggies, covered bridges, farmers markets, which are very prevalent in eastern and central Pennsylvania. All of these things are appearing on postcards. This card up on the top of the man with the horse and buggy is a card of my grandfather's step-brother-in-law in his horse and buggy that I got in a story that I will tell you further along in the process. But this photo came in a group of photos that I acquired. And then you can show the way people worked as occupational type cards. And, they come from all over the world. It's not just American. Like on the left is a card from a series called Berliner Typen, which you see in a lot of the different cities in Europe. They did these. There's a series called London Life, and, different ones. Even New York City has them, where they show people at their jobs and in occupations, and artists, and pretzel sellers, and all kinds of things like that. These were linemen stringing the telegraph lines. On the top is a photo card of builders, which was an unidentified card that I found, but it turned out with it looked very familiar to me, and I did a little research on it. It's a small hotel in Steins Corner, Pennsylvania, that was under construction. And at the bottom is a horse-drawn butcher wagon for the man who ran the butcher shop in the town in which I grew up in. So then you can also collect things that relate to the way people ate, the foodstuffs and that kind of thing. This is a great card from Nuremberg, Germany, showing the Metzger Lebkuchen factory. And what's kind of funny about this is in German, a Metzger is a butcher, but this Metzger was a cookie maker. So, and they're actually still in business today, but it shows all these different Lebkuchen around the plaque advertising his name, and it's just a beautiful card, and then has scenes of Nuremberg on it. And here are some more of those Berliner Typen cards. This is a man selling wursts and a lady selling pretzels and stangles. On the bottom right-hand corner, this is a modern postcard showing one of the staples of Pennsylvania dining, and it's called Lebanon Bologna, which is kind of a spiced lunch meat kind of thing, which if you're lucky, you can find it some places. I actually have it here in Walnut Creek. There's a place where I can get it, but it's something that we subsist on in Pennsylvania. It's the cold cut of choice practically if you're having sandwiches. But this was from Weaver's manufacturer of Lebanon Bologna, and it's an advertising card. And then there are things like the decorative arts that you can collect. On the upper left is a Frochter bookplate. And Frochter was a kind of hand calligraphy thing that was very prevalent amongst the Pennsylvania Dutch. They especially used it to make birth certificates, individualized birth certificates that families kept and treasured for their children. On the right is a decorated dower chest. It's a real photo postcard from the Reading Public Museum of a Pennsylvania German dower chest. And I want to say before I go further too, I said Pennsylvania Dutch, I said Pennsylvania German. The two kind of overlap terminologies. They say Dutch, but it's really Deutsch, which is German. So in popular culture, they're called the Pennsylvania Dutch. We often refer to them as Pennsylvania German today, but they're two interchangeable names. Another very popular thing in Pennsylvania are hex signs and barns. This barn up on the left is in New Smithsville, Pennsylvania. My school bus used to go past this barn every day, and we'd see these hex signs, they're called, and they were created supposedly to keep witches and bad spirits away. And if you actually saw this barn on old bank barns like this, on the very ends of the barn, up in the top point of the eaves, they would cut these little diamond-shaped openings to let the evil spirits exit the barn if any got trapped in the barn. On the right is Professor Johnny Ott, who called himself a hexologist, who was a modern interpreter of the hex sign. And on the left is a typical Pennsylvania German design that was created for, there's a Pennsylvania German or Pennsylvania Dutch folk festival held in Kutztown, Pennsylvania in Berks County. And this was an advertising postcard for it. And in the 1930s, there was kind of a resurgence of this Pennsylvania German culture, and they started having things like these folk festivals and stuff like that, and the hex signs, and kind of a rebirth of the language. You know, so it's something that's still very popular today, actually. And then you can collect customs and traditions. On the left, and I will pronounce this for you, it's an Easter tree putz, not a putz, which is how most people would look at it and pronounce it, but they call it a putz. And at Christmas time, you put under your Christmas tree a thing called a putz, where you put little houses and fences and animals and things like that. On the right side is the Moravian Christmas putz at the Central Moravian Church in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, which is an annual tradition there also. And then here's a really weird one. It's a bizarre Pennsylvania Dutch tradition. This comes from Boyertown, Pennsylvania, and it's the marriage hazing of Enos Lawrence Maury and Susan D. Schaefer. When they got married and went off on their honeymoon, their friends would decorate their houses with these bizarre, you know, Lawrence takes the Schaefer cure, and oh, you Sue, how did you do it? And baby carriages hung on, you know, to promote, oh, next thing you know, they're going to be having children. But it's a fantastic real photo card showing this strange Pennsylvania German tradition. So that's the kind of broad way in which you can enhance your genealogy by using postcards. The next kind of slightly narrower way to do it is regionally and locally. You know, this is where you kind of focus down to a regional and local level while not focusing on the members of your family specifically. It does take you to the towns and villages where they lived, the places where they worshiped, the schools that they attended, the businesses that they owned, and the places they called home. So you can collect, as you know, by the towns in which we lived. If you had a crossroads of a town with a little hotel and a post office and a general store, you can be guaranteed that there were postcards made of that town. And it's true all across America. Any little town that you go to, there's postcards of it. And as postcard collectors, you know how many obscure little towns appear on postcards and how many obscure people collect those obscure towns too. This is Kutztown, Pennsylvania, a fairly large town in eastern Berks County. And I wanted to point out there's off on the right, you see a cemetery with 3 circular areas. My father's last name is Koch. We pronounce it, it's the closest to the German translation, which means to cook, Koch. My mother's family's last name was Pfister, Pfister, which in Swiss German is a baker. At some point they dropped the P, so it was just Fister. The 3rd circle up in that cemetery is called the Pfister Circle because there was a very prominent branch of the family that lived in Kutztown, and they're all buried in that Pfister Circle at the cemetery there. You can collect cards of all the small towns that you come from. You know, these are all towns around the town that I grew up in, Linville, Pennsylvania, Wanamaker's, Westnersville, which is also known as Stony Run, Jacksonville, Pennsylvania. I mean, like Jacksonville has a church and a couple houses, and a funeral home. There's not much else there, but there are postcards of Jacksonville. So now we get a little bit closer to my town and my family. These are postcards of the town, Metropole, that I grew up in. Here's kind of an aerial view taken back. Right there's on the left-hand side, it's the card on the upper left. On the left-hand side, you can just see the far edge of that artificial lake in the old ice house. And if you look almost dead center on that card, there's a kind of an L-shaped house right in the middle, a big L-shaped house. Across the street from that is the house that I grew up in. There's no cards specifically of that house, but the one at the bottom, East Wayne Street, that's the street that I grew up on. And the other card on the right-hand side is the house that was across the street from where I grew up. So it's close, but not quite my house. You can collect cards of the churches that you attended. If you were a churchgoer, your family were churchgoers. This is the church that I grew up going to, which was an Ebenezer Union Church, which in Eastern Pennsylvania, there were churches that were Lutheran and Reformed because they were basically the same. And the Reformed churches are now UCC or United Church of Christ. They shared these churches. One week it would be Lutheran, the next week it would be Reformed, and then Lutheran and Reformed, and go back and forth. So there are a lot of cards of these churches. On the upper right is a real photo of the harvest home decoration at that church. And on the bottom is one of the New Jerusalem Church, which is the church that much of my mother's family had attended, the older generations, and that's a real photo card also. You can also find great cards of historic places of worship. Like on the lower left is the Exeter Friends Meeting House in Oley, which is now Exeter Township in Berks County. And on the upper right is the old Trapp Church in Trapp, Pennsylvania, which was the home church of Henry Melchior Muhlenberg, who was kind of the lead guy of Lutheranism, establishing the Lutheran denomination in the United States. His son was the first Speaker of the House of Representatives, and the church still exists. And there is a college which I attended in Allentown, Pennsylvania, named after the family, and that's Muhlenberg College. You can collect the schools that your family attended, the regular schools, the colleges, the universities. This is a great card on the right of Oxford University in England with the heraldry of all of the different schools that make up Oxford University. Now, here's an interesting card I found on eBay quite a few years ago. It's an interior view of the Eagle Point School, and the teacher is Clayton F. Levan, and he is the man standing off to the left on that photo watching these students. The interesting thing about it was he was Clayton Pfister Levan, that was his middle name, and he was a descendant of that same family that I've been tracing. And I just happened to find it because I knew who he was. It popped up on eBay, and I got this for my collection and for my genealogy. You can collect cards of the way we played. You know, there's a sports baseball team from my hometown. On the right is the Cornet Band from my hometown. On the top is a card advertising a Sanger Fest in Nuremberg. You know, the Germans were very big into singing and performing and that kind of thing. And so there are a lot of cards relating to things like that too. And then you can collect the businesses that your family may have owned. And this is a great example of no connection to me in any way, shape, or form. But what I love about it is that it very clearly lists the names of all of the owners on the bottom of the card because they were very proud of their ownership of this restaurant. And it looks like it was a lovely, very clean place by the postcard image. Here's another one, the Washington, Pennsylvania Government Post Office Building, but it's got a fabulous ad on the side for Dr. Charles Evans, an eminent specialist. I don't know what he specialized in, but you can find cards like that too. If your family member was in any kind of business, was whatever, there are cards out there. This card is just fantastic, and I missed it on eBay, but I snagged the picture. But it's from Annapolis, Nova Scotia. But the best part I love is the monkey sitting on the hood of the car, if you can see him, and the horse. And I mean, it's just, and it's the Farmer's Hotel. It's got the proprietor's name, William H. Edwards, on the side. I mean, like, what is there not to love about this card? And if this was your family, imagine how ecstatic you would be to find a card like this that depicted your family's business, and so spectacularly, if nothing else. So here's another one too. You know, a lot of times they would show interiors of businesses and the names would be on it. This was the Metropole Cafe in Allentown, Pennsylvania, which was the next largest town to where I grew up. And I had at one time had a large collection of cards in Allentown. The interesting thing about this is it was owned by a man by the name of H.O. Haas, H-A-A-S. In Pennsylvania German, a Haas is a rabbit. And so the electric sign outside of the bar had little white rabbits all around the outside of it, and the lights flashed that made it look like the rabbits were jumping around the outside of the sign. And he had a big 5-foot statue of a rabbit outside of the bar room all the time. But take note to that room all the way in the back. I think there's a big slot machine back there, but it looks pretty nondescript. Well, this guy was quite the collector, and at some point in time, he redecorated. He was a big game hunter, a gun collector, a coin collector, and he did this spectacular double-fold postcard of that back room redecorated with powder horns and long rifles and trophies and his guns and coin collections. And then when you flip the card shut, there was this fantastic explanation on the back, telling what everything was on it, especially the gigantic stuffed moose and where he had hunted it and how he had it stuffed and everything. Country hotels were a very popular thing in Pennsylvania too. So on the top is the Hotel Moulton in Moulton, Pennsylvania. On the bottom is the Hotel German and the Miller Hotel. Those hotels were owned by my brother of my great-grandmother. And the Miller Hotel, store and hotel, the one that says Hotel German on the right, burned down in 1916, and then they built the one on the left, advertising them on postcards. So there again is another way you can find family connections on postcards. Here's the home restaurant in Allentown. When the one brother that owned the Hotel Miller sold it, he moved to Allentown and he opened up this restaurant. Here's a postcard of his restaurant in Allentown that he owned for a great many years. And I had never seen this card in all my years of collecting and just found it on eBay about a year ago. And then you can collect small businesses. You know, this is a Musselman jewelry store in Allentown, and Merkel and Company, which was a grocery store, family-owned grocery store in Allentown. So if your family was in any way connected in any kind of business like that during the height of the postcard period, there's probably some postcard out there showing your family's business somewhere. If you search long enough and hard enough, you'll come up with something. You can collect cards that show the houses we lived in. You know, in Pennsylvania, the colonial era is yesterday, you know, and it was very well documented. On the left, on the top, is the George Taylor House in Easton, Pennsylvania. Taylor was one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. That house is still there in downtown Easton. At the bottom is another one that in Birdsboro that was a signer of the Declaration. On the top is the John Andrew Schultz house. Here are some that are historically important. Conrad Weiser's home on the right, the Kemp's Hotel in Maxatawny Township. The bottom, the Mounts Jones house. Each one of them has a certain amount of genealogical information that's attached to the card that you can, you know, if you are a descendant of this family, these would be great cards to find, and they're kind of readily available. You see them rather frequently. And this one's really great that even the tree merits a postcard. It's the tallest tree in Pennsylvania at the time on the Rothermole homestead in Berks County, Pennsylvania. And then there are homes of more recent vintage. So that Pfister Circle at the cemetery that I was telling you about, this is a card up on the left of Colonel Thomas Pfister, who lived in this house in Kutztown, Pennsylvania. And this guy was quite a character. He was born in Kutztown, Pennsylvania, married a woman from Talladega, Alabama, and was in Alabama at the outbreak of the Civil War and got taken into the Confederate Navy, where he served in the Confederate Navy. I didn't even know that they had a Navy until I started researching that story. But he served in the Confederate Navy, and finally, as the Confederacy was falling, managed to get away by getting onto a raft and floating down the Mississippi. And when if anyone tried to stop them, they started talking in Pennsylvania German so that they had no idea who they were or what they were talking about, and thought that they weren't Confederates, and they sailed right past the Union lines back to Pennsylvania and made it back home to Pennsylvania after that. But this was his home in Kutztown. And then all over, you can find homes, you know, the Wentz Farm in Briningsville, the Houghton residence in Catasauqua, Pennsylvania. Here's a great one of the suburban neighborhoods in Allentown, one of the first ones, called Hamilton Park, where each one of the homeowners is identified with a picture of their home. These subdivisions were often advertised on postcards. And I will say, you know, the more prominent your family was, the more likely you are to be able to find cards showing the homes of those family members. You know, the lower you were on the rung of importance in a community, the less likely you were to be able to find cards. But if you found views of the town, you could often find your home on, you know, broad views of the town. And here's some others from other areas of the country. You may recognize the one on the upper left hand. That's from San Francisco, from my San Francisco collection. It's on California Street, just up the hill from the Whole Foods at Franklin and California Street. And on the right is the Paterno, Castle Paterno in Washington Heights, and, you know, different homes of doctors and ministers and people like that, you know, were shown on postcards. And I will say, you know, I have a very large collection of San Francisco cards. I have probably 100 or more real photo postcards of homes in San Francisco. And they weren't all spectacular homes. They were homes from out in the avenues and in the Richmond district. And they weren't all houses like this. There were a lot of people that went around taking photos of homes and putting them on postcards for the people that lived there. And then you can collect their final places of residence. And I love this card. I saw it probably 40 years ago in Postcard Collector magazine. Somebody had done an article about death on postcards, and I thought, wow, that is so spectacular. For years I looked for a copy of this card and finally found it, of the Fairview Mausoleum in Milwaukee. And just as in life, the famous are depicted in their final resting places. This is the General Reynolds Monument in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. On the bottom are the tombs of the Prussian royalty in Berlin and Charlottenburg. And the not so famous, this is Nisky Hill Cemetery in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania on the right. On the lower left is the Charles Evans Cemetery in Reading, Pennsylvania, you know, showing prominent graves and tombs and chapels and things like that. And if you're really lucky, you might even find a relative. These are all postcards that I got on eBay. At the top right are the graves of the pioneer Dietrich family members of Mosellum Church in Berks County, Pennsylvania. On the left is the grave of Paul and Maria Balliet in the old graveyard at Nest, Pennsylvania. And on the bottom is a cemetery in Shoemakersville, Pennsylvania, which I was able to track down who the people were that are buried on that card. And interestingly, those tombstones were changed when they kind of fell out of style, and there's more modern tombstones on that grave today. And sometimes you even find actual postcards of tombstones themselves. And the more unusual the stone, the more likely you are to find it. Like the one on the right, the Elia Corti Monument in Barre, Vermont, is just spectacular, with a carving of the man who was buried there. And on the left, interestingly, this is a real photo postcard from Nisky Hill Cemetery in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. I used to drive by this tombstone all the time, and it's spectacular when you see it in person. It's probably 15 feet tall. It's this beautiful brown granite, beautifully carved, and it's just really cool. One time at an antique show in San Mateo, I was flicking through a box of postcards, and there was this postcard of this tombstone from Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. And the minute I saw it, I knew exactly what it was. I didn't even have to read the message on the bottom. I knew where it was from. So now here's where we get down to the kind of finest point of collecting personal family stuff on postcards. If you're really lucky and you work all the angles, you may just come up with some postcards of your very own family. As hard as it sounds, it really does happen. And I'm going to tell you some stories as I show you these postcards so you can see how that actually happens. You can collect by surname. These are all Pfister related postcards. On the left is the Maison Pfister in Colmar, France. On the right is the Pfister Hotel in Lugano, Switzerland. On the bottom is the Hotel Pfister in Milwaukee. Some of you may remember on the TV show Laverne and Shirley, they used to talk about the Hotel Pfister in Milwaukee. There are spectacular cards like the Tuck series of the Scottish Tartans, and you can collect by family that way in surname. You can collect coats of arms on postcards. Sometimes your name just pops up. I mean, this card from Allentown is, I always think, is so amazing. It's the Wineburger triplets, who were playground pets at the Riverfront Playground in Allentown, Pennsylvania. I mean, if that was your family, again, how fantastic would it be to find a card like that of your family on postcards? This is an interesting card that I found. It's from Slatington, Pennsylvania. It's from Lehigh County. I found it many, many years ago. I was in high school at the time when I found it, and I took it home. My next door neighbor, who was probably in her 70s at that time, had gone to Slatington High School. I took it over and I showed it to her, and she goes, "Oh, I know all those guys. That's for Coach Smith up on the left. He was our basketball coach. The guy on the right was Professor Snyder. He was a hunchback." But she knew all of these guys that had played basketball there, and they were all identified on the postcard. And you know, I'd probably paid $1 for it or something like that. But it was just kind of fascinating that these things are out there waiting to be found. This is an interesting San Francisco card. I love stumbling on cards like this. I saw this postcard on eBay one time. I could see that the kid in the photo was reading the San Francisco Examiner by the masthead on the newspaper. And because I collect San Francisco, I like cards that show people from San Francisco too. So I bought this. It just said Laurent Louston on it, age 2 years or something like that. And I've had it for a long time. So when I was redoing this postcard talk to give to the San Francisco Club, I went back and I started looking at it again. Well, it turned out Laurent Louston is actually Lawrence Lawston, who was 2 years old. And I could specifically pinpoint this card because I could read just enough of the headline of the newspaper to go into newspapers.com and search on it and find that it was Standard Oil dissolved by Supreme Court. It was the Tuesday, May 16th, 1911 edition of the San Francisco Examiner. So here was an eBay mystery. This card popped up. It was postmarked, or no, not postmarked, but it was mailed to my hometown. I bid on it and I bought it, but I couldn't really make it out that well on eBay. But I figured, well, it went to a family, the Kuntz family, Kuntz. They were a family that I knew. Actually, my neighbor across the street, her maiden name was Kuntz. So when I got it, it turned out the card had been sent to her grandmother. And when you read the message, the people who sent it, the man all the way on the left with the little blue line over his head, that was Percy. Rosa and Percy were the ones that sent it. Rosa was the daughter of Mrs. J.A. Kuntz, who this card was sent to, and that was the uncle of my neighbor, the man that's depicted on the card. And here are two more. I went to an antique show one time, and there were, a handful of dealers in the area in Lehigh County who bought old paper and photos and things like that that were just general line antique dealers. They weren't paper dealers per se. I got there and I found this fantastic box of old photographs, and I started going through them and quickly found two photos mounted on board from my church, which you had seen earlier on that postcard. And I grabbed them and I was like, well, if these are here, I wonder what else is here. I went back and I started going through the box again, and I found these two postcards in the box, along with a whole bunch of other photographs, including one of my great-grandmother that I bought from this man. Fortunately, the one on the bottom right had everyone identified, and I knew probably, I think, 5 of the people on that photo from when I was a little boy, and they were in their 70s and 80s at the time, and from a fairly large family from the same town that I'm from. On the upper left, it had a message, that card on the back, that when I did a little research, it turned out that the old man with the beard sitting down and the lady in the back with the dark blouse were husband and wife. They were related to all of these people on this other photo. And the lady in the top row, all the way on the right, with kind of the high waist, was the sister of the man with the white beard on the bottom, that I was able to trace back through the details that were on the message of the card. So then getting a little closer, here's one finally that was from almost direct family of me. This popped up on eBay about 15 years ago. This is from the store in New Tripoli, and this is Charlie Miller, who was my grandfather's cousin, standing behind the counter in the store that he worked in at Miller's Hotel, which we saw in one of those earlier postcards. So I was ecstatic. There aren't really a whole lot of real photo cards. While the town that I'm from, there's probably 60 postcards from this little town that had a bank, a church, 2 little country hotels, and a general store kind of thing, and a bunch of houses. But there's literally probably 60 postcards from that town, if you can believe it. But real photo cards are not very plentiful. And so when I found this, I was ecstatic because it was one of the few real photos I had ever really found of depicting anything in the town. So then here's another one I found on eBay at one point, and I bought it. And it took a little while, but somebody did an Arcadia book about the area of the northwestern section of Lehigh County. And lo and behold, there was the photo identified. The man in the middle holding the wire was Anson Pfister, and he was the president of one of the local telephone companies. And this was stringing up the telephone lines through one of the small towns close by to where I grew up. And here's another interesting story. So I had a great aunt, my grandfather's sister, who said, "Oh, I have all of these old postcards. I'll have to give them to you sometime." So I waited and waited and waited. And it probably took about 15 years till she finally dug them out. But here was the story behind them. The lady pictured on the photograph was Katie Miller, who was my great aunt's aunt. And she had tuberculosis, and she died on April 25th, 1912. But before she died, they had a card party for her. And so while most of the postcards were kind of nondescript greeting, you know, the ones you find in quarter boxes a lot of times, when you flipped them over, they had all been sent to her by all the people in the town that I grew up in, including my grandparents, my grandfather, my great grandparents, my great aunts. And, you know, and as I went through this pile of postcards, here I was making all of these connections from this group of cards that she gave me from this card party for this poor woman who died of tuberculosis. Then we had a small amusement park in the town that I grew up in. It opened in 1929. The man down in the bottom postcard with the white pants was the owner of the park, and he was the grandfather of the lady that lived next door to me. And so he was somebody I knew as a little boy. He was quite old at the time. They had a miniature railroad at this park, which my grandfather used to run the railroad, you know, drove the engine. However, the man driving the engine was my neighbor from across the street, and all of the people sitting in the cars behind it were his wife and children, relatives of the man in the white pants down below. And they were all people that I knew, my family knew. And so they're just these great cards to have. There's a series of about 6 of them from this little amusement park. So now we're getting just even closer now to my family. So these are postcards. My father grew up in Lehighton, Pennsylvania, which was in Carbon County, which was just the next county north of Lehigh County, where I grew up. My grandfather was an engineer for the Lehigh Valley Railroad. And so this kind of semi-modern card of a Lehigh Valley Railroad engine at the Lehigh station really has a lot of meaning to me. The card on the top shows an old silk mill in the town, which we used to pass by all the time when I was a little boy when we'd go to visit my grandfather. And my father had us guess what a water tank did like that on the top of a building. And we figured out, you know, on that silk mill building. The card on the right of the Murphy 5 and 10 store, when my uncle found out that I collected postcards, he goes, "Oh, I have some postcards. I'll give them to you." So he pulled out this postcard. It was a real photo postcard of the G.C. Murphy store on First Street in Lehighton, which we used to go shopping in all the time when I was a little boy. He had worked there in the 1930s, had taken this real photo postcard of the front of the store, and the store managers had liked it so much that they sold this postcard in the store, and he gave me his copy of it. So then here's another one from my mother's side of the family. My grandmother, who was very dear to me and who I loved very much, worked at Dorney Park, which is an amusement park in Allentown, Pennsylvania. So I have many fond memories of going to Dorney Park. When she worked there, she worked in a waffle and ice cream stand, which was right outside of the merry-go-round. So she would take me on that merry-go-round, and then we'd go for a ride on that miniature railroad at Dorney Park. And it just, you know, finding cards like this that have such personal meanings to you, if you are into your family history and stuff, are just great cards to be able to find. Here's one that I found on eBay not that long ago, the home of my 7th great grandfather, Peter Troxall. And it was a series that were done because a trolley line went nearby this house. So there was a series of cards showing scenic views along this trolley line. I had never seen it. It popped up in a search on eBay, and I think I have on there, I paid $8.75 for it. So now here's an interesting story. These are my family on postcards. This is my grandfather, Reuben Koch Sr. The one in the middle is him and his horse and buggy alongside the Lehigh Canal in Weisport, Pennsylvania, and the other 2 are photos. So when I say to you that you have to work this a little bit, one of the key things is work every angle you know. Tell everybody that you know, I'm interested in my family history. Do you have any photos? Can I see them? That kind of stuff. One time in Pennsylvania, they have a lot of auctions and they have them at houses. Fridays would always be the big day that all of the auction ads would be in the newspaper that would list where the auction was, what the contents were that were going to be sold, all of that kind of stuff. I saw there was going to be an auction in Lehighton, Pennsylvania, for an estate of a man who I knew had been related to my grandfather. He was would have been his step nephew or half nephew, because it was the son of his half sister. So I thought, well, I'm just going to take a chance and I'm going to go there. So I go to the auction and I'm looking around, looking to see, well, maybe there's a family Bible or any kind of old photos or something like that. I couldn't find anything. So I saw a lady who looked kind of like the type that you just would have pegged as a genealogist. I can't even begin to tell you why I thought she was. I just thought she was. And I went up to her. I told her who I was. And I said, do you by any chance have any photographs or any family stuff that's going to be sold or whatever? And she goes, oh my God, I have a whole box of photographs here that I had put aside. We put them aside. We called your uncle and nobody ever came to pick them up. We were going to get rid of them if nobody wanted them. And so by the skin of my teeth, I basically rescued this whole box of antique photographs of my family, of my grandfather, of my aunts and uncles, real photo postcards of my family members, just by taking a chance and going and looking for if they even remotely had something. I found all of this stuff. Here are a couple other cards. The one on the left is my maternal grandfather, Edwin Pfister, and that's him in his Metropole cornet band uniform with his cornet. A family member, a distant family member, gave that to my mother, and my mother gave it to me. On the right is my grandmother, Margaret Pfister, the lady that worked at the amusement park. The photo on the bottom are my two eldest uncles, Paul and George Pfister. These cards, the one of my grandmother and of my uncles, a cousin of my mother's had. And she was cleaning out and moving to an assisted living facility and called me up and said, hey, I have these photos. Are you interested? I said, how soon can I come and get them? And I went, and she gave me a huge pile of old, these were real photo postcards and mounted photos. But this was all because she knew that I was interested in my family's history. So that's the talk. A few things to help you get started. There are some great websites if you want to try looking for things from your family. Deadfred.com, Ancient Faces, photodetective.com, of course, Ancestry.com. And the usgenweb.org is a kind of umbrella website that every state has their own US Gen website, and then every county within every state has it, and it's all volunteer driven. There is so much data out there on every one of those county websites that you can find all kinds of stuff that aren't necessarily readily available on places like Ancestry or on other websites. There are Facebook genealogy groups. Some of the people who are here participating tonight are friends of mine from those groups. I moderate a group for Berks County, Pennsylvania, and help moderate one for Lehigh County, Pennsylvania. And there are people who are in those groups that I told about this, but we exchange all kinds of fantastic information back and forth, share photos and discoveries and things like that. A lot of counties, a lot of towns have Facebook groups for information like that. It's well worth looking into them. And if you don't find one, start one on your own and invite people that are interested, and just moderate it on your own, which was basically what I did with the Berks County site. I just stumbled on the Lehigh County one and then went looking for a Berks County one, and I couldn't find one, so I started one. Also, postcard books and resources for identification, guides to the backs of real photo postcards can help you identify who the people on the cards are if you have some, but you don't know who they are. You can kind of take them in context with, if somebody gives you a bunch of photos and they're all kind of the same family, it helps to pinpoint using, you know, that kind of methodology, cluster genealogy, they call it, to try and figure out who these people are and these different things. So those are just some great sources to look for information. And, you know, Ancestry is probably the easiest one. What I will say to anybody who hasn't tried any genealogy yet, if you go to Ancestry, do not trust any family tree on Ancestry as being accurate. Take everything out there with a grain of salt. Do your own research. Look for your own documents. They're great to use as guides, but there are a lot of people, if you know that terminology, GIGO, garbage in, garbage out, people who just go, oh, hey, that's somebody, and grab the information and plug it into their tree. And it's nobody that's even remotely related, but the more times people keep copying it, the higher it rises to the top of the list of best results. And that's how you end up with bad information. So vet your own information if you go do this and try to do it on your own, because first off, it's fun to make those discoveries on your own, and finding those census pages with your family on for the first time and seeing their names and their occupations and whether they rented or owned their homes, and, you know, the English as their primary language and where their parents were born. It's fascinating. And when you start doing it, you're going to enjoy it. So Ancestry is a wealth of information. Just trust your own instincts with the data that you find, and take anything else with a grain of salt would be my best piece of advice to anybody. So that's it. If there are any questions, I'm happy to field questions from people. If you have any, just speak up and let me know.
Fantastic job, Glenn. I enjoyed that very, very much. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it was a pleasure. I'm just thrilled to death that you joined us, and can't thank Lynn enough for encouraging you to join us tonight. It was very interesting. The only thing I have to say is my ancestry, as far as you know, looking back on yours, your family's been around a longer. I'm kind of a both my mother's family and my father's family are all relative newcomers compared to you, so it's a little more difficult from our family, but I enjoyed your talk very much.
Well, thank you. And I would say that about the being around. Yes, you know, the Pennsylvania Germans, I am in some cases the 9th and 10th generation of my family in the United States. Other families who have not been here nearly as long, there are records and documents out there too. And if you go on Ancestry and have a worldwide membership, if your family is of more recent vintage to the United States, there are records from all over the world that you can research on too. So there is stuff out there. Don't let that be a stumbling block for you.
Thank you.
Tell me, is this picture the Columbarium in San Francisco?
It is. It's actually a double fold real photo postcard of the Columbarium that the other half of the card shows the catacombs inside.
I just went in there a few weeks ago, and it's open now for anybody.
Oh, okay.
There, have a look.
It's a pretty cool place.
Yes, it is. Very cool.
And what's interesting about it is if you look off to the side, you can see all of the tombstones and all of the stuff, and even around the base of the Columbarium, all of which have been removed and moved to Colma. The only thing left of Oddfellows Cemetery is just the Columbarium. And as we see in the news every so often, the people that they left buried that they didn't move, that they discover when they dig up sewer pipes or something. But
I tried to find my great grandparents there. This family story was that they were interred there, but they had no record, whatever.
Well, interestingly, on Ancestry, I will tell you this with regards to San Francisco, they have fantastic records online of like Halstead, Gray, and Carew, and all of those funeral homes. And there are a lot of records, surprisingly, that are out there to be discovered if you have it wasn't all lost in the fire.
I started collecting San Francisco postcards in 1939, so I think
Wow. I have probably 20,000 postcards of San Francisco.
I used to get old albums, though, from the original collectors.
I bet.
They wanted me to preserve their cards.
Well, see, and that's much the same thing like with these family related things too. You know, people are loath to dispose of that stuff. And so the minute people start to know that there is at least somebody in the family who has an interest in it, they pass stuff along. And, you know, a lot of times, even if they have something really great, they're happy to have a copy of it, just have a copy of it, and we'll give you the original. I have a friend who used that tactic very effectively when he wanted to acquire an old photograph of someplace. He'd say, "Can I make you a copy of it and keep the original?" And half the time they'd go like, "Oh yeah, no problem, just make me a copy," and he'd get the original of it. So it works.
I have a picture of my great uncle's candy shop in North Beach.
Oh,
he was a native of San Francisco named Will Kaiser.
Oh,
and
that's
he had his Kaiser's candies in North Beach, and he refused to change the name during First World War.
Oh, yeah, that could have been a little difficult.
But he said he was born in San Francisco, period.
Well, thank you again.
Sure.
If there isn't any other questions, I just want to thank Glenn very much for giving us that talk. I thought it was fascinating. My wife has gotten into some genealogy on her family and my family, and it's a great thing to look into. But I never really thought about the card aspect of it, but tonight opened my eyes. So that's wonderful.
Well, good. That's good. I'm glad.
Yep.
And you know what? I'm on Facebook. Look for me if you have any questions after the fact or something comes up and you want to reach out. Just send me a message or friend request or something, and we can chat on there. And you know, I'm available.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you very much. And
Sure.
Glenn, or Hal, I was thinking about you when that show was going on with the amusement parks. That had to hit home, huh?
It did. It was wonderful.
Glenn's family, or Hal's family, owned an amusement park in Wichita, Kansas.
Oh, okay.
So it was, when I saw that, I was kind of thinking about him.
Thank you.
Which amusement park?
Joyland Park.
I have a couple cards or two from there.
Do you really? Oh,
maybe one, maybe just one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's where I grew up. I'm 78 now, and I have a card. When we do the next meeting where we show a card, I'll show you one of my dad holding me when I was 4 years old in front of a merry-go-round behind him.
So, oh, I'd love to see that.
Yeah, that'd be fun.
And see if I have a Joyland. I might not. I know there are a few out there.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, wonderful.
Thank you, Nancy.
Yeah.
You'll remember I gave you a lot of cards of old parks like that.
That's right. That's right. It's a wonderful thing, you know, as far as our hobby is concerned. Just this little conversation that we're having right now brings people together from all over, and it makes it better every time we have a meeting, which is a wonderful thing. Well, listen, I know for a lot of folks, it's especially, you know, back east, it's getting kind of late. And so I thought maybe it would be a good time to bring it to a close, unless anybody has anything to add to the meeting. Why don't we close? And I wish you all a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. I'm looking forward to seeing as many of you back in January as possible.